Good night. Imagine, at the age of 5, being told by your own mother that your worth as a girl was measured by how pale your skin was? Tonight, we're heading back to 1347. You won't believe the rituals and procedures women had to go through to look pretty back then. I'm going to show you a world where you'd happily give up every bit of what people call beauty, just to escape the suffocating and brutal expectations placed on women. You'll be horrified to learn the story of Elena, born into a wealthy medieval household, and destined to a life of silence, blind acceptance of the social rules and endurance. In this era of sophisticated high-tech cosmetics procedures and fierce social media competition, you'll be astonished to learn how brutal the ideals of beauty in the Middle Ages were for women. Hang in there. This isn't your average tearjerker. Instead, it's a cozy bedtime story, weaving a tale of how far we evolve as women through the centuries. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. So let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. In the 1340s, to be beautiful was to be pale, quiet, and restrained. Cheeks were to be colorless, drained of all suspicion of labor, heat, or desire. Lips, small and barely parted. Freckles were vulgar. Foreheads have to be wide and hairless, with brows plucked to near invisibility. Hands, soft and white as raw milk. And the waist, the smaller, the better. A fashionable girl's silhouette was not curved but collapsed, a soft S-bend of shoulder, corseted rib, and sloped hip. Freckles were vulgar. Fat was a sin. Laughter too loud was a red flag. A beautiful woman, in noble circles, was meant to look almost unfinished. Like a watercolor left in the rain. And so, the training began early. Elena was 9 the first time she fainted during a fitting. It was summer, and the linen corset her nursemaid laced over her shift had been dampened first, tightened wet, then left to dry stiff on her ribs so it wouldn't stretch with her breath. It was an old tailoring trick, used to set a slim shape into the fabric, long before the girl had grown into it. That's how you train a waist, her mother had explained, lightly. Before it gets ideas. Elena had been trying to read aloud from a psalter when she slurred a word and tipped sideways, hitting the wooden chest with her shoulder on the way down. The chambermaid fanned her with a book of psalms until she woke. Then stood her back up. And they began again. Because in Elena's world, the world of noble daughters in the 1340s, beauty was not something you were born with. It was something you were disciplined into. Elena's days began before sunrise. Her chambermaid woke her by opening the shutters just enough to let the chill in. Children woke with the daylight. Not alarms. Not school bells. Just the rising sun slipping in through woolen curtains. In Elena's household, like in most noble homes of the 1340s, the day began not by choice, but by light. Candles were made of tallow or beeswax. The former stank and smoked. The latter was sweet and clean but wildly expensive. In a manner like Elena's, beeswax was reserved for altars, feast days, and her father's study. So, morning routines happened with the sun. By midsummer, that meant waking before 6. In winter, much later. Elena would rise with the help of her maid, usually a woman just a few years older, often a peasant's daughter brought into service in exchange for coins or grain. Her gown for the day would already be laid out, warmed if the family could spare a fire. She washed her face with water from a ceramic pitcher left out overnight. First her dark auburn hair was brushed with bone combs and coarse bristle brushes, dipped in vinegar to discourage lice and lend shine. Hair was a source of pride, but only if controlled. Loose hair was immodest. Hers was braided in tight coils and bound with silk ribbon, even before breakfast. Next came the skin treatment. Freckles were treated with raw lemon or vinegar compresses. A mixture of ground pearl and white lead was dusted onto her cheeks to even her tone. Lead-based cosmetics were a common upper-class treatment. Despite being mildly toxic, they achieved the pallor that was so desired, especially in southern Europe. Elena's mother preferred the English recipe, flour mixed with egg white, dried on the skin to a pale film. If it cracked when she smiled, she was told to stop smiling so much. Baths, real, full-body immersions, were not daily, not even weekly. Depending on the region, noble girls might bathe just once a month, sometimes less in winter. When she did, the process was elaborate. A large wooden tub was hauled into her chamber, lined with linens, and filled with water heated by hand in cauldrons. Her hair would be combed with oils afterward, scented with lavender if available, and braided tight to avoid tangles. Her undergarments were changed more often than her gowns, but rarely laundered in full, just aired out by the fire. Linen was precious and had to last. Unlike a modern child's school day, Elena's education was piecemeal. She would spend the early hours reciting prayers or practicing reading from a book of hours, a religious manuscript that might contain a few painted illustrations and Latin verses. She likely couldn't understand most of it, but memorization mattered more than comprehension. Girls were trained in grace, not grammar. Breakfast, if it existed, was plain, a slice of bread with watered wine or weak ale, maybe cheese or cold porridge. The main meal, dinner, came around 10 or 11 in the morning. It was the largest of the day, when the household gathered for stew, meat if it was a feast day, or fish during Lent. Elena would eat at a side table, not with the men. But in general her meals were small. Some broth, some thin bread, stewed pears. The nursemaid sometimes whispered, "We eat enough to look faint, not enough to feel it." Each bite was watched. Too much, and her mother would sigh. Too little, and she was praised. Afterward came embroidery, or music, or supervised walks around the garden, if the weather was fair. These were not leisure activities, but rehearsals, demonstrations of discipline, femininity, and patience. A crooked stitch could be commented on. A flushed cheek might draw a frown. Too much time in the sun, her mother would say. You'll brown. By today's standards, Elena was a child. But in her world, she was in training. Training to manage servants. Training to stand still, to carry herself lightly, to eat sparingly. To respond softly and never interrupt. There were no toys. No playdates. No books just for fun. Only the long preparation for a role she did not choose, and could not refuse, getting married with whoever would offer the best family alliance. Elena could read Latin prayers, mostly, but not write. Reading was graceful, passive. Writing, too close to expressing an opinion. And noble girls were expected to have grace, not opinions. She was never alone. Her governess and maid remained nearby at all times, not only to chaperone but to monitor posture. Elena wasn't allowed to slouch, to lean back in a chair or to run as any child her age. A crooked spine or unladylike gait would make for a poor marriage match. And matches were everything. Sometimes, she was weighed at day's end. Not on scales as we might picture today, but using a balance beam, a simple wooden arm with weights on one side and a small platform or sling on the other. A maid would gently help Elena step in, holding still while iron counterweights were adjusted. The practice wasn't universal, but in some noble households, especially in southern France and northern Italy, records mention the tracking of daughters' delicacy as part of dowry negotiations. Thinness, while not medicalized the way it is today, was considered a sign of restraint, wealth, and breeding. A well-fed but visibly frail daughter suggested a family that could afford food, but had the discipline to raise a girl untouched by appetite. This wasn't about health. No one believed a thin girl was stronger. But she might marry higher. A merchant's son might marry for money. A baron's son might marry for lineage. But all of them, it was said, looked first at the waist. It wasn't shameful. It was routine. Just one of many numbers that would determine her future. At night, her face was rinsed with rose water. Her lips rubbed with goose fat. Her eyebrows checked for strays. Her hands were wrapped in soft cloth, tied loosely so they didn't roughen in her sleep. And still, even with all this effort, Elena knew she was not the prettiest girl her mother had seen. She once overheard the seamstress murmur, "She'll need a good dowry." Being fat, or even slightly well-fed, was considered shameful for young women. It implied laziness, indulgence, and worst of all, fertility. A round belly suggested childbirth. And nothing horrified a marriage-minded mother more than her daughter appearing ready. So girls like Elena were served small, broth-heavy meals. A few soaked almonds. A slice of boiled pear. Bread without butter. And every indulgence was met with a long stare from her mother's table end. In Elena's house, thinness was praised as restraint. She learned to treat hunger as a virtue. She once ate chalk before dinner just to feel full. Today we call it disordered eating. In her day, it was just being well prepared for marriage. A beautiful woman, in noble circles, was meant to look almost unfinished. Like a watercolor left in the rain. But beauty wasn't only about how you looked. It was how you behaved. A truly beautiful girl was quiet. Obedient. She wouldn't interrupt. She wouldn't sweat. And she certainly wouldn't ask questions. Joy was acceptable, but only in moderation. Laughter had to be soft. Crying was never permitted in public. Anger? Completely out of the question. It was an early form of branding, really. A noble girl was a display piece, like a carved ivory chess piece on a lord's shelf. Today, we have social media filters. In the 1340s, they just filtered the girl herself. Today, 9-year-olds have iPads and cereal. Elena had a corset and a book of psalms. Elena turned 12 the year her father began inviting guests to dinner specifically to observe her, as a possibility for a future bride. By now, her waist was handspan narrow, her cheeks always pinched just before supper for color, and her hands scrubbed with lemon peel to keep them soft, even though she wasn't allowed to do any real work. On those nights, the household changed its rhythm. Her nursemaid would brush her hair with a comb carved from boxwood, part it down the middle, and bind it in 2 long braids tied with silk ribbons dyed in the family's colors. If the weather allowed, a fine veil of lawn or gauze, sometimes even imported from Flanders, would be pinned at the crown of her head, signaling both her virtue and her father's wealth. Her face was powdered lightly with ground lead, yes, lead, to pale her skin. This was a known practice by the late Middle Ages, and by the 14th century, nobility often relied on a combination of vinegar washes, egg white masks, and arsenic-based creams to maintain that sickly, desirable glow. If her cheeks needed more color after the pinching, a little beetroot or crushed rose petals might be dabbed on, a practice later referenced in 15th century beauty manuals from Italy and France. And perfume? Not the kind we think of now. She'd dab her temples with a cloth steeped in lavender water or a mix of vinegar and spices, intended to mask the odors of a body rarely bathed and rooms poorly ventilated. Cleanliness was not visual, it was olfactory. And women like Elena were expected to smell like virtue, not effort. Her gown was chosen days in advance. Likely made of dyed wool or silk-lined linen, depending on the season, it would be laced tightly to show the shape of her newly emerging figure but still modest enough to appear untouched. Colors mattered: blue for fidelity, green for fertility, gold for prosperity, and the finer the embroidery around the collar, the louder it spoke of lineage and care. She would eat little. Just soft barley or thin broth. Nothing messy. Nothing smelly. And nothing that might stain her teeth or leave a bit of food in the corner of her mouth. The men at these dinners, merchants, knights, widowed landowners, weren't particularly interested in her conversation. They'd ask her father about her dowry, not her opinions. Her hymnal skills, not her education. Her family's alliances, not her dreams. Because Elena, like every noble girl of her rank, was not being raised to become herself. She was being groomed to become useful. And in 1347, a beautiful daughter was a tool, a political promise wrapped in silk. What she wore was chosen for who might see her, what she ate was calculated for how she'd look. And what she said, was almost always decided for her. At 13, Elena's mother entered her room just after sunrise, carrying a folded piece of parchment in one hand and nothing at all in the other. Not a brush, not a ribbon, not even a cup of watered wine. That alone was strange. Most mornings, there was something to prepare, a braid to fix, a dress to mend, a blemish to conceal. But today, there was only the quiet rustle of stiff paper as her mother sat down at the edge of the bed and laid it across Elena's lap. It was a list of 4 names. 4 men. They were all older, wealthy, and were interested. One held salt mines along the coast and had already buried 2 wives. Another had 5 children and wanted a 6th, not a child, but a wife to raise them. The third was rumored to be gentle and deeply pious, though his chin sunk into his collar and he never once looked a woman in the eye. And the last, well, the last was known to strike his servants when he drank. But his vineyards wrapped around the border of Elena's father's land like an embroidered hem, and that kind of stitching was hard to ignore. Elena hadn't met any of them. Hadn't asked to. That wasn't how it worked. Her mother, ever careful not to betray urgency, simply tapped a manicured finger against the topmost name and said, "We will pray on this." Then she rose, closed the door behind her, and left Elena alone with the list, not of suitors, but of futures. She stared at the paper for a long while, then folded it neatly, as she had been taught to fold everything: linens, letters, grief. She tucked it inside her prayer book without a word, brushed a wrinkle from her skirt, and walked to breakfast. Because in Elena's world, daughters were not expected to choose their fate, only to accept the shape of it. And obedience, above all else, was the trait most praised in a beautiful girl. That morning, no one said anything more about the list. They didn't have to. Because a well-trained daughter already knew what answer to give, even before she was asked the question. By the time Elena was 14, she had been inspected more times than she had been spoken to. That spring, she was taken to a merchant's estate just outside the city walls, a formal visit, her mother said, with no expression. They were to meet the son. Elena had heard of him, of course. Everyone had. His family sold spices, which meant they were rich, but not noble. Which also meant they were desperate to marry upward. She sat quietly in the chair as the boy entered. He didn't speak or bow. He didn't even look at her face. He stared at her hands, then her waist, then turned to his father and asked, "Is she finished growing?" The deal wasn't done that day, but the calculations had begun. 2 weeks later, Elena was weighed. Naked, behind a screen. Measured at the collarbone, wrist, and ankle, because it was said that delicate bones meant delicate lineage. Her father beamed. "She has fine proportions," he said, as if she weren't there. "Good skin, good bones. And quiet, thank God." They noted her hair color in ink. Chestnut, with a red sheen in the sun, not ideal. Blonde was best. But her dowry would compensate. And it was a good dowry. 3 parcels of land, 3 trunks of linen, and a small vineyard her grandmother had left in her will. Elena didn't know where it was. But now, it was part of her worth. She was silent through it all. Because a noble girl's silence was part of the bargain. And it had been for centuries. In medieval Europe, especially by the 14th century, daughters of noble families were not expected to marry for love. They were assets. Negotiations began as early as age 7, and by 12 or 13, the pressure mounted. Dowries were everything. A girl with blonde hair, blue eyes, and pale skin was said to require less land to compensate. Dark-haired girls, especially if not thin or obedient, were sometimes called expensive. Appearance became economic capital. And for those who didn't fit the mold, the sickly, the outspoken, the ones with visible birthmarks or strong features, many were sent to convents. Not always as punishment, but as a financial decision. The church required a fee, but it was cheaper than marrying her off. Marriage contracts were recorded in meticulous detail, right down to what the bride was expected to bring in terms of property and physical condition. In some Italian and French families, girls were weighed before the agreement was signed. There are records of fathers refusing matches if a girl had gained weight by the wedding. Some contracts even required virginal appearance, not virginity itself, but the look of it. Marriage, to them, was not about partnership. It was about display. As horrible as it sounds to imagine women being poisoned in the name of beauty, some things haven't changed as much as we'd like. Today, a woman might scroll past flawless 20-year-olds on her screen and wonder, quietly, if the lines around her eyes have deepened since last month. She might ask for retinol for her birthday. Stir collagen into her morning coffee. Avoid the sun, not because she's vain, but because somewhere along the way, she was taught that youth means value, and that aging must be managed. Like Elena, she's not trying to deceive anyone. She's just doing what she's been told is necessary, to be admired, to be taken seriously, to be seen. Not with powder, but with filters. With serums. With silence. And sometimes, even now, the cost still falls on her body. Elena was 18 when she became pregnant. At first, her husband was pleased. A boy, he hoped. To carry the name, to carry the land. But as her body began to swell, first her breasts, then her stomach, his gaze grew distant. He no longer looked at her with the same pride. In the evenings, when he returned from court, he barely touched her hand. By the 5th month, he had moved to the adjoining chamber. She still wore the pale powders, though they caked at the corners of her nose. Her ankles, once slim and admired, were now swollen. Her hair, no longer brushed as often by the maids, dulled to a copper tangle. She felt heavy, winded by stares. Her once favored gowns no longer closed at the ribs, and her new ones were stitched with a sigh, hastily, plainly, as if to say, "This will be over soon." But of course, childbirth was not a moment. It was an ordeal. And in her world, it was a private one. No physicians. Only the midwife and 2 older women from the village who had seen dozens of births, but could promise nothing. Elena's mother had not come. Her husband stayed far away. There were no written instructions, no soothing words, just a copper basin of warm water, a candle, a prayer. The pain arrived like a flood. And when it broke her, screaming, the midwife gripped her shoulder hard and whispered, "Don't make a scene. Men don't like women who complain." She tore. She bled. Her vision blurred from the strain. The baby came before dawn, a girl, quiet and small. Elena held her for a moment before the child was taken away to be washed. She barely registered the words of congratulations. What she did register, what stayed with her in the days that followed, was her body. The midwife called it normal. But it didn't feel like hers. Her belly, soft and marked like clay. Her breasts, heavy and sore. Her skin, once milk-white from powder and pale fasting, now tinged yellow with bruising. Her hair thinned at the temples. Her gums bled when she smiled. And in the silvered mirror gifted at her wedding, she saw a stranger. She stayed in confinement for weeks. Not for rest, but because women were expected to hide during that time. Stretch marks were shameful. So was hair loss. So was the loose belly, the soft jaw, the slack skin around her knees. No one said it aloud, but every other woman knew. Even in the moments meant to be sacred, to hold a child, to have survived what many did not, beauty was still currency. And she no longer had any to spend. The old nursemaid whispered that lemon peel could lighten stretch marks. That rose oil would soften the skin. That bone broth would tighten things. She tried them all. Elena was not alone. She had sisters. And friends, the kind born of proximity more than choice. Daughters of other noble families. Girls raised in the same silence. Taught to smile without showing teeth. To lower their gaze, but never their standards. They were not allowed to visit one another freely, not without a chaperone, not without a reason. But still, they found ways to be together. On feast days. During embroidery lessons. While kneeling side by side in the chapel, hands folded in prayer, eyes quietly scanning each other's faces for signs of change. Sometimes, they spoke in careful phrases. Sometimes, not at all. Because even among girls, honesty could be dangerous. But there were moments. Small ones. Like when Elena's younger sister whispered, "Does he treat you kindly?" And then looked away quickly, as if afraid of her own question. Or when a friend pressed a folded piece of linen into her hand, soaked in rosewater, to cool the burning her husband's powders had left behind. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. They sort of understood each other, in their own fragmented ways. And funnily enough, none of them would have ever used words like control or oppression. Not because these feelings were foreign to them, quite the opposite, in fact, but simply because those concepts hadn't been given a name yet. What they did know was this. Some girls cried after their weddings. Some never made it back after giving birth. And some? Some were packed off to convents for being difficult, which was often code for too plain, too smart, or just a little too boisterous. They didn't question the system out loud. But they questioned each other, gently, carefully. The way one might test the ice on a frozen lake. "Do you ever wish," one of them asked, "that we could just stay like this?" She didn't mean forever. She meant before marriage. Before the rules got heavier. Before their bodies were handed over like dowry chests, measured and appraised by men they didn't know. Elena didn't answer. But she squeezed her friend's hand under the table. That was enough. And in this way, quietly, carefully, they offered one another something that the world around them never did, which was recognition through a shared glance, a hidden smile. They didn't know life could be different. But they knew something wasn't right. And for girls raised to believe that beauty was everything, that small knowing? It was its own kind of rebellion. But time, as it always does, kept moving. Elena bore 5 children. 3 daughters. 2 sons. One of the daughters died in infancy, the others survived. Her body changed with each child. Her waist widened. Her hips ached in the cold. Her hair, once the envy of courtly dinners, dulled to a soft brown streaked with gray. And the powders that once masked her exhaustion no longer sat neatly on her skin. They cracked, settled into the fine lines around her mouth, refused to behave. Her husband said little, except to remind her that noble women had a duty to maintain their presentation. Even as her beauty faded, because that beauty had once been a form of wealth. A social currency. A kind of leverage, and leverage, once lost, could not easily be forgiven. She did what she could. Kept herself clean. Brushed her hair. Ate sparingly, even when her hunger screamed. She no longer bled each month, but the memory of bleeding, for beauty, for obedience, for approval, had never truly left. And so she faded. Not suddenly. Not tragically. But quietly, as so many women did, in so many ages. Until, at last, the girls who had once whispered beside her in embroidery circles were gone or cloistered or married off to lands too far to visit. Her world grew smaller and quieter. And she began to realize the truth. That beauty was never meant to be hers to keep. It was meant to be borrowed for a time. Until age crept in. Her daughters now brushed their own hair, pinched their cheeks for color, walked carefully so their steps were light and graceful. She watched them, silently. And she wondered if they would ever realize, before it was too late, that the world had told them the same lie it once told her. The lie that beauty was the highest form of value. And the deeper lie. That they had no say in whether they wanted that value at all. This is why you wouldn't want to be pretty in the Middle Ages. Because once you were, you weren't allowed to stop. Elena was a creation of her time. But the time isn't as far away as it seems. Her corset may be gone. Her powdered lead may be buried in the apothecary records of the 14th century. But the mirror she feared? That's still hanging. It just looks a little different now. Because centuries later, a woman wakes up, reaches for her phone, and is instantly met with a carousel of images, curated, brightened, filtered. A sea of 20-year-olds with glass skin and sculpted jaws, telling her what to buy, what to wear, how to glow. As we move from the 13th through the 15th centuries in Europe, the shifting ideals of beauty reveal not freedom, but evolving constraints. In the early 1200s, beauty had a more bountiful edge. Church sermons praised rounded women with soft cheeks and gentle curves, as signs of fertility and divine favor. Clothing layers were heavier, necklines higher, and waistlines undefined. Pale skin remained ideal, but flesh was not necessarily a disgrace. A well-fed woman represented abundance, village health, and a prosperous household. Despite this slightly broader ideal, hair removal was still seen as virtuous. Women were expected to pluck their eyebrows and even remove body hair to appear refined rather than athey or peasant-like. By the time Elena was growing up around 1347, beauty had hardened into discipline. Cleavage was even beginning to be rated. Hair was no longer soft and flowing but hidden under cauls, veils, and the steeple-like henning, forcing hairlines even higher through shaving or plucking. Luxury fabrics of velvet and patterned silks displayed status, but soft beauty was shaping into control. By the late 1400s, the henning became taller. Necklines deeper. Slashed sleeves revealed contrasting undersleeves. The silhouette shifted toward the high-waisted. In early 15th century France and Italy, small, firm, widely spaced breasts were prized above all, labeled as white, round like apples, hard, and firm like it happens today. Elena is older now. Her hair, once golden and coiled into impossible shapes, is silver and braided loose. Her skin no longer holds the powdered glow her husband once demanded, and her corsets, thankfully, have long since been burned. She is no longer useful to society. Not admired at court. Not asked to dance. Not considered beautiful. But in the quiet of her small upstairs chamber, she sometimes hears laughter from the garden, her grandchildren chasing chickens, weaving flowers, squabbling over nothing at all. And she smiles. One afternoon, her youngest granddaughter climbs up onto the bench beside her and gently brushes her hair. Not for a portrait. Not to tighten it into something artificial. Just because it's soft. "You're beautiful," the little girl says. Elena starts to correct her, out of habit. To explain that her face is lined, her body round, her arms soft. But the child isn't looking at her face. She's looking at her eyes. The same ones that watched over her when she was sick, that told her stories by candlelight, that lit up when she walked into a room. And for the first time in Elena's long, quiet life, she believes it. Not because she's young. Not because she's flawless. But because she's here. And she's loved. She no longer fears being seen. And for the first time, she finally feels free. And maybe tonight, wherever you are, your worth has nothing to do with your reflection either. Not the size of your jeans. Not the shade of your skin. Not the lines that gather when you laugh. You are not a portrait to be judged. You are a story still being written. And if you've ever looked in the mirror and wondered who you are, beyond the filters, beyond the rules, beyond the noise, I hope this story reminded you. You were never meant to be perfect. You were meant to be you. So rest now. Let your body soften. Let your thoughts be quiet. And let the world, for once, expect nothing from you. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, now it's time to let it go. Script written by Clara Finch, because some stories still deserve a soul.